What do people really see first when a celebrity's face changes too much to ignore? Beauty, age, or damage? Some of these stars were once remembered for the exact features that made them iconic. A sharp jawline, soft lips, expressive eyes, cheekbones the camera seemed to love. Then something shifted. The cheeks looked heavier, the lips looked overfilled, the skin seemed pulled too tight, and the face the public had known for years began to look less like time had passed and more like something had gone wrong. Tonight, we are looking at the plastic surgery stories that left fans stunned and turned admiration into uneasy fascination. Because behind every swollen contour, stiffened expression, and altered silhouette, there is usually more than vanity. There is pressure, fear, image, money, and the quiet panic of watching youth slip away in public. And the first story on this list may be one of the clearest examples of how reinvention can become its own kind of warning. "I stand for freedom of expression," Madonna once said, and for most of her career, that belief seemed written across her entire image. She was never just a singer. She was reinvention in motion, the woman who could change her sound, her style, her politics, and somehow still remain unmistakably Madonna. In the 1980s and 1990s, her face carried that same power. The jawline was strong, the brows were bold, the eyes had that sharp, challenging stare, and the whole effect felt controlled, athletic, and fiercely alive. She did not look delicate. She looked untouchable. That is exactly why the later changes hit people so hard. As the years passed, the face many fans had memorized began to soften in ways that felt less like aging and more like intervention. The sharper angles seemed buried beneath fuller cheeks. The skin appeared smoother but also tighter, especially around the mid-face, as if expression itself had been pushed into stillness. Her lips looked more pronounced, her contours rounder, and the natural balance that once gave her face such force started to look heavier, puffier, and less defined under stage lights and close camera shots. By the time she appeared at the 2023 Grammy Awards, the reaction was immediate. Viewers were not just commenting on age, they were reacting to a face that seemed altered enough to interrupt recognition. Still, reducing Madonna's story to swollen features and internet mockery misses the darker truth underneath it. Few stars have lived longer under the demand to remain culturally current, physically desirable, and visually marketable at every age. For women in pop, that pressure is relentless. For Madonna, it was multiplied by decades of being treated as a symbol rather than a person. So when the public stared at the tighter skin, the fuller cheeks, and the increasingly sculpted look, what they were really seeing may have been more than cosmetic change. They were seeing a woman still fighting the same brutal industry rules she had challenged for years: stay desirable or disappear. And if that transformation felt unsettling, the next one made Hollywood nostalgia look almost unrecognizable. For much of the 1980s and 1990s, Heather Locklear was one of those television stars who seemed to embody effortless glamour. Audiences first noticed her on Dynasty, but it was Melrose Place that turned her into a defining face of prime-time television. With her bright eyes, high cheekbones, controlled smile, and that unmistakable mix of elegance and sharpness, Heather had the kind of beauty that looked perfectly built for the camera. She did not need exaggerated features to stand out. What made her memorable was how balanced everything felt. The structure was clean, the expressions were alive, and the overall effect was polished without looking forced. Years later, that familiar balance began to look different in ways that were difficult to ignore. The change was not really shocking because it happened all at once. It was unsettling because it seemed to build slowly over time. The cheeks that had once looked naturally sculpted began to appear fuller and heavier, as if volume had gathered where definition used to be. The lower face often looked softer, while the skin itself could seem unusually smooth beside features that appeared slightly swollen under direct light. In some appearances, the midface looked padded outward, and the jaw, once crisp and camera-ready, no longer framed the face with the same clean precision. There was also a faint tightness to certain expressions, the kind that makes a smile look restrained rather than free. Nothing about it felt grotesque, but that almost made it sadder. Her face did not collapse into disaster. It drifted away from the version people remembered, little by little, until the old sharpness was buried beneath puffiness, softness, and the visual strain of trying to hold on to what had once come naturally. What gives Heather Locklear's story more weight is that appearance was never the only thing changing. Behind the fuller cheeks, smoother skin, and less defined contours was a woman moving through years of personal instability, addiction struggles, and public scrutiny. That is what makes the transformation linger. It was not just a conversation about beauty. It became another reminder that in Hollywood, even a face once admired for its natural balance can end up looking worn down by pressure, by time, and by the desperate need to keep both from showing. And if Heather's transformation felt gradual, the next one hit with a very different kind of force, because the face people remembered did not just soften. It seemed to harden into something far less forgiving. For audiences who grew up on classic Hollywood, Kim Novak was not just another leading lady. She was one of those rare faces that seemed to carry both glamour and mystery at the same time. Her performance in Vertigo made that image unforgettable. In her prime, Kim had a softness that never felt weak, luminous skin, delicately shaped cheeks, arched brows, and eyes that could look distant one second and deeply vulnerable the next. Nothing about her beauty seemed aggressive or overworked. It felt graceful, controlled, and almost weightless on screen, which is part of why Swila, her face so clearly for decades. That memory is exactly what made her later public appearance feel so startling. When Kim Novak appeared at the 2014 Academy Awards, the reaction was immediate. The face many people remembered as refined and naturally balanced now looked far more rigid under the lights. Her cheeks appeared rounder and fuller, as if the old bone structure had been padded over. The skin looked tighter, especially through the mid-face, giving certain expressions a slightly fixed quality. Her lips seemed more pronounced than they once had, and the softness that had defined her beauty in earlier years now competed with a look that felt heavier, firmer, and less responsive. It was not just that she looked older. It was that some of the delicate harmony people associated with Kim Novak had been replaced by a face that seemed pulled between preservation and distortion. The result left many viewers unsettled, because the contrast between then and now was not subtle. It was the kind of change that made nostalgia stop feeling warm and start feeling uneasy. What many people missed in that moment, though, was the life behind the face. By then, Kim Novak had already survived breast cancer, endured a serious horseback riding accident, and spoken openly about living with bipolar disorder. Long before that Oscars appearance, she had stepped away from Hollywood and chosen a quieter life centered on painting and animals instead of constant visibility. That is what gives her story more depth than the usual plastic surgery conversation. The fuller cheeks, tighter skin, and altered features became the part everyone stared at, but they were not the whole story. What stood there that night was not just an aging actress being judged against an old image. It was a survivor walking back into a spotlight that had never really learned how to look at human beings with mercy. The discomfort does not end there, because the next story is far less subtle and much harder to look away from. For years, Janice Dickinson was introduced as the kind of beauty the fashion world could not ignore. Long before reality television made her loud, confrontational, and unforgettable in a different way, she had already built her name on a face that looked made for magazine covers. In the 70s and 80s, her features had the kind of dramatic geometry photographers loved instantly. The cheekbones were high and sharply cut. The jawline looked clean and sculpted, and even without heavy styling, her face carried a natural intensity that could dominate a frame. She did not need excess to look striking. The structure itself did the work. That is exactly why the later transformation felt so severe. As the years went on, the face that had once looked angular and sharply defined began to take on a much heavier, more manufactured appearance. Her lips started to look enlarged beyond their natural shape, with a swollen, overfilled quality that drew attention away from the rest of her features. The cheeks appeared lifted and padded at the same time, as though volume had been added while the skin was also being pulled upward, creating that unmistakable look of a face caught between inflation and tension. In certain appearances, the skin across the midface looked stretched too smooth, while the mouth area seemed crowded by fullness that made her expressions feel tighter and less spontaneous. The overall result was far harsher than simple aging. It looked like a face repeatedly pushed, filled, and adjusted until the bold, natural architecture that once made her so magnetic was no longer leading the image. Instead, people saw exaggeration first. What makes Janice Dickinson different from some others on this list is that she never built her public persona around softness or fragility. Even later in life, she remained confrontational, theatrical, and completely aware of the image she was projecting. But that confidence also made the visual change harder to ignore, because the face now seemed to advertise the very excess it may once have tried to hide. The tragedy is not that time changed her. Time changes everyone. The tragedy is that a woman once admired for bone structure, edge, and natural drama ended up with features that looked swollen, tightened, and overworked enough to overshadow the beauty people remembered in the first place. Subtlety is not coming back anytime soon, because the next face carried a different kind of change, one that felt quieter at first and sadder the longer people looked. In the 1980s, Daryl had the kind of screen presence that felt impossible to manufacture. Whether audiences remember her as the mermaid in Splash or the haunting Priz in Blade Runner, the face attached to those roles was instantly recognizable. Her beauty never looked fragile or overly polished. It had strength in it. The cheekbones were dramatic, the jawline was firm, and her bright eyes gave her an intensity that could feel luminous in one scene and almost dangerous in the next. What made her stand out was not softness, it was structure. Her face had shape, edge, and a kind of natural wildness that Hollywood could not easily mass-produce. That is why the later changes felt so quietly disorienting. Over time, the facial architecture that once made Daryl so striking began to soften in ways that seemed heavier than ordinary aging. The bold cheekbones looked less visible beneath, added fullness, as though the natural planes of her face had been covered over, rather than allowed to evolve. The skin often appeared smoother, but alongside that smoother surface came a faint tightness that made certain expressions seem more controlled and less spontaneous. In some appearances, the midface looked padded outward, the contours less clean, the old sharpness blurred by swelling and cosmetic volume. Nothing looked cartoonish, but the difference lingered because it changed the emotional effect of her face. The woman who had once seemed fierce and unmistakably natural now looked as if some of that original freedom had been pressed inward by the effort to preserve it. The result was not a spectacular disaster. It was something quieter and, in a way, more melancholy. A face losing some of the very character that once gave it power. What deepens that feeling is everything Daryl chose to do outside the machinery of Hollywood. Rather than cling to fame at all costs, she gradually stepped back from the relentless spotlight and devoted much of her life to activism and causes far removed from celebrity vanity. That makes the transformation feel less like a tabloid punchline and more like a reminder of how hard it is for any public figure to escape appearance as a lifelong burden. Even when someone seems to value privacy, meaning, or a quieter life, the face still becomes the headline. The softened contours, heavier cheeks, and slightly tightened expressions may not tell the whole story, but they do leave behind the same unsettling question that hangs over so many stars from that era. At what point does trying to preserve a face begin to erase the very force that made it memorable? The next story takes that question somewhere far less reflective, because this time the change became one of the most talked about features in Hollywood. For many viewers, Rinna was the kind of television personality you recognized instantly. Long before reality television turned her into a louder and more polarizing public figure, she had already built a career on a face that felt energetic, sharp, and easy to remember. In her earlier years on Days of Our Lives and later in the 1990s, her look had a natural brightness to it. The eyes were expressive, the smile was wide, the cheekbones were defined, and the overall effect felt lively rather than manufactured. Even when she played dramatic roles, there was a sense of movement in her face. It looked animated, spontaneous, and fully her own. That is what made the transformation impossible to miss. Unlike some stars whose changes built gradually and stayed ambiguous, Rinna's lips became the center of the entire conversation. Over time, they began to look dramatically larger than the natural proportions of the rest of her face, with a swollen, overfilled shape that pulled immediate attention away from her eyes and bone structure. The upper lip, especially, started to look unnaturally projected, as though softness had been replaced by pressure. In certain appearances, the mouth area looked crowded, stretched, and slightly stiff, making expressions feel less relaxed and more controlled. As other cosmetic changes appeared to add fullness through the cheeks, the balance shifted even further. The face that had once looked bright and mobile now seemed more padded, more inflated, and less delicate in motion. The tragedy of it was visual before it was verbal. People did not need a rumor to understand something had changed. They could see it the moment she smiled. What makes Rinna's story different is that she eventually spoke about it herself. She has said that she first got silicone in her lips at age 24 after being influenced by seeing Barbara Hershey's lips in the film Beaches, and over time, that decision became one of the most defining and controversial parts of her appearance. Later, she also acknowledged that the silicone caused problems and that she underwent a procedure to remove some of it. That honesty gave the story a rare layer of clarity. It was no longer just public speculation. It became a cautionary tale told by the person who lived inside the face everyone was staring at. And that is what makes her transformation linger in a different way. It was not just excess, it was regret made visible. The final face on this list may be the most difficult one to forget, because by the time the public noticed the change, the old image was already slipping out of reach. For a period of time, Lara Flynn Boyle had the kind of face Hollywood could never confuse with anyone else. When Twin Peaks turned her into a recognizable name, it was not just because of the show's strange atmosphere or cult status. It was also because her features carried their own kind of drama. The cheekbones were sharp, the face was narrow, the eyes felt cool and distant, and the whole effect gave her a severe elegance that stood apart from softer, more conventional beauty. Even later, as she moved into projects like The Practice and Men in Black 2, that same facial structure remained one of the first things people remembered about her. That is why the change felt less like aging and more like disappearance. Over time, the bold architecture that had made Lara Flynn Boyle so striking began to fade beneath a face that looked fuller, rounder, and far less defined. The cheeks appeared inflated, almost as if the natural hollows had been packed over until the old shape could barely breathe underneath. Her lips looked larger and less refined, with a swollen quality that disrupted the delicate proportions her face once had. In some photos, the midface seemed padded outward while the skin looked stretched smooth across features that no longer moved with the same lightness. The result was not just cosmetic change, it was visual confusion. The old severity was gone. The sharpness was gone. What remained was a face that looked softer in the wrong places, heavier where it had once been sculpted, and strangely disconnected from the image audiences had carried in their memory for years. It was the kind of transformation that made people stare twice, not because they could not remember her, but because they were trying to understand where that original face had gone. What gives her story its own sadness is how quiet the public image became around it. Lara Flynn Boyle never turned the speculation into a running performance. She did not build a new persona around the change. She seemed to drift further from the center instead, leaving the public with a contrast they kept revisiting on their own. That silence made the transformation feel even colder. There was no big confession, no theatrical explanation, no attempt to reframe the narrative. Just the lingering impression of a woman once known for one of the most distinct faces of her era, later appearing with features that looked swollen, overfilled, and visually far removed from what had made her unforgettable in the first place. Sometimes, that is what makes a Hollywood transformation hit the hardest, not the noise around it, but the absence of anything that can explain it away. By the end of stories like these, the strangest part is not that fame changes a face. It is how often the change seems to come from fear more than vanity. Fear of aging, fear of disappearing, fear of no longer matching the image the world decided to remember. In a place like Hollywood, beauty is never just beauty. It becomes currency, pressure, identity, and for some people, a trap that tightens little by little until the damage is impossible to hide. Some of these transformations were dramatic. Others were quieter, sadder, and harder to explain. Either way, they all leave behind the same question. When does trying to preserve a face begin to erase the person inside it? Tell me in the comments which story stayed with you the most and which celebrity you think deserves a deeper look next time. If this is the kind of Hollywood story you like exploring, subscribe and stay with us for the next one.